Good afternoon and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Recently, Syria has witnessed a historic turning point with fall of Bashar al-Assad's authoritarian regime. The newly established Syrian transitional government now faces the monumental task of governing a nation long torn by conflict. To help us understand the unfolding situation and explore critical issues such as America's role in Syria, Russia's strategic involvement, and broader implications for the Middle East, we are honored to have with us Ms. Anna Borshchevskaya joining us today. Anna is a renowned expert in this field and the author of highly acclaimed book Putin's War in Syria, Russia's Foreign Policy, and the Price of America's Absence. Published in 2021, the book provides a comprehensive analysis of Russia's intervention in Syria and its impact on global geopolitics. Anna is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, where she focuses on Russia's policies towards the Middle East. In this interview, we will delve into her book while connecting its insights to the recent developments in Syria. Before we begin, here is a quick note. You can find the link to Anna's book in description box below, so do check it out. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Ma'am, to begin with, I would like to ask, how do you view the recent events in Syria, particularly the sudden fall of the Assad regime? And could you also provide some context about the background of the newly formed Syrian transitional government?
Sure. Well, first, the way to start understanding what's happened is first to recognize that this is a historic shift in the Middle East. This is the fall of one of the worst dictatorships in the world. When you think of some of the worst places in the world, like North Korea and Assad's Syria are right up there. And that means there are potential enormous opportunities to reshape the Middle East towards a better, more peaceful, more stable future. And the other thing, one other thing to understand specifically from Russia's perspective is that for Russia in particular, although Russia did support Assad really unequivocally from the very beginning of uprisings against him in 2011. For Russia, Syria was never specifically about Assad. Putin didn't seem to even, frankly, like him or respect him. And it was never really even about Syria. It was ultimately about positioning Russia in opposition to the United States. In other words, support of Assad was really about Russia's stance against the US-led liberal global order. And in that context, Russia did not want to let the United States allow the fall of yet another authoritarian whom Russia supported. So Russia could not allow the United States to topple yet another authoritarian. What Russia ultimately wanted in Syria was a regime that would ensure its interests. And in reality, they simply did not see any alternatives to Assad. But the bigger picture here is that it was never about Assad and never really about Syria for Russia. It was about the United States. And what had happened in Syria for years, really since 2020, is Syria had turned into what we would call a frozen conflict after Russia and Turkey brokered a ceasefire. And the thing to know about frozen conflicts is that Russia is a master at managing frozen conflicts. Russia had fomented and managed the so-called frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space. And Syria, in a way, became an extension of that. But the thing to know about frozen conflicts is that ultimately no conflict is ever truly frozen. And it's really just a matter of time before things break down. And that is, I think, what we saw unfold in Syria in late December. The timing of it can be a surprise. The details of how and when it might happen may be a surprise, but ultimately it's an unstable situation. When you have an unstable situation, it's really just a matter of time. So when you look at it from that bigger context of what this was really about, it may have been a surprise in some sense, but it was also not really a surprise because it was ultimately just a matter of time.
Yeah, now coming to your book, so what was your primary motivation for writing about America's role in Syria? To what extent do you believe there was an absence of US leadership in the Syrian conflict?
I lived in Syria in the summer of 2008. And to me, Syria felt very Soviet. I was born in Russia, it's still when it was the Soviet Union. I witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union as a child before I immigrated to America as a refugee with my family. Syria was the one place, I have traveled to many places, but Syria was the one place that felt very Soviet to me. I had not experienced that anywhere else. And it's if you research the history of Syria, it's no surprise. Assad's Syria during the Cold War had emerged as a top Soviet Union ally, or in fact, Soviet broadcasts referred to Syria in a very special way. They referred to Syrians as friends and allies. So the Soviet legacy was very prominent. Not only was it very prominent in Syria, but it was unique compared to other parts of the Middle East. I wanted to write this book because I thought it was important, because I lived in both countries that I write about, Russia and Syria, and I'm an American citizen, so of course I live in the United States. So I am familiar with all of these countries involved, and I thought it was important. What I know firsthand as somebody who experienced the Soviet Union, um, how important American leadership is in the world, what an important part the United States plays in the world stage. And unfortunately, even within the United States, we now have a situation where we question our role in the world. We question whether or not we're a source for good. But I, as somebody who had experienced life in a very different place, know that has, America can make mistakes. We're not perfect, but we are a source of good in the world. The US-led global order, the system created, that the United States helped create after the end of World War II, and the security architecture with the end of the Cold War that the United States helped create had ushered in an unprecedented era of peace and stability. When you think about when you think about the grand scope of human history in terms of centuries, not in terms of decades. And I think that absence of America's leadership often leads to tragedy, and that is what we saw unfold in Syria. Syria needed America's help. The United States could have done more to help, because Russia, and again, you need to think of it not in abstract, but not in a vacuum, but in relative to other countries. Russia is looking for chaos. Russia sees itself in a perpetual conflict with the West, and it derives its sense of importance, its sense of self, through perpetual conflict. So when America does not step in, when America does not help, other actors step in. And in Syria, that was Iran and Russia. And this is what happens when there's an absence of America's leadership. You have war, you have chaos, you have instability, and ultimately it hurts American and more broadly Western interests as well. This is also about American security.
So, looking at the international angle of the recent developments that have happened in Syria, how do you analyze Washington's role in these developments? Do you think that the United States has made a strategic counterplay to Russia's involvement in Syria?
Well, I think these events happened. These events happened on their own. The United States was largely observing. And the question, first, the critical component of what happened here is that Russia decided to stop supporting Assad. And these events unfolded incredibly quickly. When you think about the way I look at it is, I'm reminded of a very famous quote from Hemingway from his novel The Sun Also Rises, where the main character is asked, "How did you become bankrupt?" And he says, "At first, gradually, and then suddenly." And I think that's a very good way to understand what had happened in Syria, where you had this horrible dictatorship that Russia had propped up for years, and all of a sudden it just collapsed suddenly. Russia appears to have been taken by surprise at just how weak Assad had been, most likely because Russia was distracted in Ukraine. But for whatever reason, they decided to stop supporting him. I think they had enough resources to give him, at least in the beginning. There's a lot of discussion, at around that time had focused on whether or not Russia has enough resources to give to Assad. But I think at the time they did have enough resources. I don't think it was a matter of resources. I think for whatever reason they tried to do damage control and they decided to cut their losses and convinced him to leave. But what it shows is what to me the situation what it shows is that and this is something that I've argued over the years all along. Putin was not a friend till the end. He likes to posture as somebody that does not abandon his own. Unlike the United States, that's the narrative that the Kremlin puts forward, and the fact that that the Russians gave him refuge is again a little bit of that damage control that they did give him that they didn't give him up to a mob, for example. But the fact of the matter is, for whatever reason, they made a calculation to abandon him. And instead, they decided to take their chances in the post-Assad Syria, which brings us again to my original point, that is that for Russia, this was never about Assad. It's really about a regime that ensures its own interests. And the question for Washington now is, what is Washington going to do? From my perspective, analytically, what is Washington going to do to ensure that Russia is completely pushed out of Syria? Russia is at this point halfway out of Syria's door. And it has the potential to entrench itself further. How is the United States going to engage? There are a lot of unanswered questions here. We do have a roadmap. There is an international document that was agreed upon years ago through the United States, through the United Nations Security Council, and that is Resolution 2254, which outlines a transition, a political framework and a transition, sort of a very general blueprint for Syria, but there are many unanswered questions. And what's happening now is that everybody's trying to figure this out, trying to answer these questions. A big question, of course, is what is HTS about? And that's to your earlier question: who is this person, Jelani? What is Syria's government going to look like? Is it going to be inclusive? Is HTS, which has links to Al-Qaeda, which has links to some of the worst terrorist organizations that are on international sanctions lists and on U.S. sanctions lists, are they going to show that they've moderated? Certainly right now they're saying the right things, but what the United States had said is that they need to show with deeds, not with words, that they've moderated, and that's one of the key questions going forward. But in my view, and to go back to my original point about the role of the United States, Syria's best chance in building a more stable, secure future is with the help of the United States rather than Russia and Iran.
Yeah, so now coming to again this Russia's position. So as Assad now seeks refuge in Russia, what do you think the game plan is for Putin's administration, and what influence does Russia still hold in Syria in terms of its intelligence networks or local allies on the ground?
Sure. So first, Russia still has access to its military bases in Syria, and that is the naval facility Tartus and an air base in Khmeimim. There appears to have been, according to press reports, a very orderly drawdown. And what's interesting is that the fact that it was orderly confirms that Russia received security guarantees from the current interim government. It's still unclear exactly what assets are there, but the fact of the matter is the big thing to know is that Russia still has access to its military bases. The other thing to know is that Russia is a signatory to the UN Resolution 2254 that outlines a transition for Syria's future. And Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So from a diplomatic perspective, Russia still has a role to play in post-Assad Syria. And lastly, but certainly not least, Russia has business interests in Syria. And that was the subject of my recent article, where with everyone looking at the fate of Russia's military bases. I think a very important question going forward, rather, is how is Russia going to position itself from a commercial perspective in Syria? Because Russia had had won rights to telecommunications companies in Syria, to telecommunications infrastructure. Russia's paramilitary group Wagner, now rebranded as Africa Corps, had exploration rights to Syria's energy resources, which is another very important component in terms of in terms of key strategic assets and infrastructure of Syria. Also, Syria's phosphates. Phosphates are important for, amongst other things, for fertilizer, but also in some cases for certain nuclear materials. So, and that's just to give you a broad snapshot. And I think right now the key question going forward is with sanction waivers being issued against Syria's regime. Remember that for years, the Assad regime was encased in a very complicated network of sanctions from the West. Is Russia going to find a way around these sanctions? And to me, that is a very important question. Certainly, Russia has a lot of practice, a lot of history in evading sanctions through third parties, through shell companies, and so forth. And I think because, and to your question about potential intelligence networks, that intelligence influence that Russia historically had in Syria, again, going back to the Soviet era, Russia has a lot of influence in Syria that it could potentially leverage. And if we already see Syria's leadership saying that that the relationship with Russia is deep and strategic. What Russia lastly also has to offer in terms of negotiations with the existing Syrian government is that Russia can offer HTS international legitimacy at a time when the West, for the right reasons, is being very cautious. Because again, these are individuals and groups that have ties to terrorist networks. So I think it is important to be cautious and to wait for these for Syria's leadership to show with deeds, not with words that they've moderated. But Russia has no qualms in working with anybody who suits their interests. Russia likes to pay lip service to the importance of combating terrorism, but in reality, that's simply not true. Russia did not target ISIS or al-Nusra in Syria with any consistency. In fact, if anything, Russia indirectly helped strengthen it. And in Afghanistan, the most prime example is that in Afghanistan, Russia recognized the Taliban. Remember that the Taliban historically is anti-Russian, but Putin had remember when the United States had withdrawn from Afghanistan, Putin made a speech where, if you read between the lines, he pretty much all but acknowledged that eventually Russia will recognize the Taliban, and over the years that had come to pass. So the idea that Russia will not work with a radical Sunni group simply because there's a history of Russia suffering from terrorism, Sunni terrorism internally, does not hold scrutiny. So from a practical perspective, despite the fact that there is a lot of, with good reason, a lot of animosity towards Russia in Syria, from a practical perspective, HTS has reasons to want to work with Russia. And that, again, that adds to the sense of urgency, I think, for the West to instead position itself rather than allow Russia to entrench itself in multiple ways beyond simply a military presence in Syria.
Yeah, now coming to the broader implications. So, what broader implication do you think Syria's conflicts, whether during the ISIS era or like Assad's authoritarian rule, have had on the Middle East, and how they have affected the region's stability and dynamics as a whole?
So Syria's importance from a geostrategic, geopolitical perspective cannot be overstated because of its location. Syria served as a hub for terrorism activity all throughout the region. With the rise of ISIS, Syria's Assad, our analysts tend to argue that the issue of terrorism in the Middle East was a dichotomy between Assad and ISIS, that it's either his rule or ISIS, but in reality, they're almost two sides of the same coin. And in a way, again, the rise of ISIS was you could attribute it indirectly to the Assad regime, and certainly Assad allowed over the years the passage of foreign fighters through Syria, and that is only the Sunni terrorist angle. There's also the Shia terrorist angle that is coming from Iran and its proxy Hezbollah, which had also entrenched itself further in Syria. So Syria, so because of Syria's location, because of where it is, and because of its relationships with the Middle East, in the Middle East historically with Iran, and with how it stood up, how Iran, Assad was at the center of the so-called axis of resistance to Israel, from both geographic and political standpoint. Syria was really at the center, and that is why Assad's fall is so important. There is this when you have one of these key pillars of terrorism, of war crimes, of instability, of chaos, fall, there is an opportunity to reshape a better future. But there are also many unanswered questions on what that might look like.
Yeah, so how do you think the Syrian crisis impacts the world in general? And do you believe the new administration in Syria will be able to meet public expectations, particularly given the country's severe economic challenges, including a recent bread crisis?
Well, I think again, I think that is one of the key questions to watch going forward. And the honest answer is I think we simply don't know. There have been many concerns that the new administration in the United States, that Donald Trump might withdraw from Syria. And certainly when we think back to his first administration, he tried many times to withdraw from Syria, but ultimately walked back. And there are different views. There are different views on this topic. If you watch his comments, where he says that this is not our fight, that we should have nothing to do with this, that does raise concerns. But I think whether or not Trump is actually going to do it is still an open question. If the United States does withdraw, then once again we're left in the same scenario where it simply creates more openings for bad actors like Russia and Iran, potential rise of ISIS, other terrorist networks, and frankly that will in time create a situation where there will be even more of a need for the United States to intervene, again for its own security. So what the Middle East shows us time and time again is that when we want to disengage, uh, um, and when we try to disengage, Obama did this in Iraq, only to have to come back again because of the rise of ISIS. Is that we may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in us. And the fact of the matter is, there are again there are lots of reasons to be concerned that the United States might withdraw from Syria, but I think at this stage it's too early. I think we need to wait and see what Trump's policy might actually look like. And at this point, other than the statements, we simply don't know. Now to your other question about Syria's economy, about wheat, if I heard it correctly, right? I think you mentioned wheat. Syria has no real institutions at this point to speak of. Syria will need to build institutions. And from a Western perspective, when you think about a commercial presence, when you think about trade, in order to have a functioning economy, you need to have institutions. You need to have these systems in place. Right now we don't know. We're waiting for this to take place. But I think that adds to reasons why we need to be having a conversation and a plan to position the West and Western partners that would be in a better position to help rebuild Syria. From my perspective, I think it would be important to get Ukrainians to help, and specifically in your question of wheat. Russia, up until recently, was the biggest supplier of wheat to Syria, and now these shipments have been suspended. Ukrainians have already offered to help. And frankly, the grain that Russia had provided to Syria was largely stolen from Ukraine. So from any kind of perspective, from the perspective of the West, from perspective of Syria, it would make all the sense in the world to have Ukrainians help deliver wheat to Syria. And from an American interest, think of it this way. If Russia is able to entrench itself and further in Syria and derive revenue from a commercial presence in Syria, it will have all of these resources to spend on the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is a global affair. We can't pretend that it isn't. And Putin made it that way by invading Ukraine. So Syria is very much connected to these larger global conflicts, and the epicenter of which right now is Ukraine.
Yeah, in conclusion, today's discussion has shed light on the complexities of Syrian transition, the geopolitics dynamics at play, and the challenges ahead for the Syrian transitional government. Ms. Anna's insights drawn from her book, Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy, and the Price of America's Absence has offered a nuanced understanding of Russia's strategy, America's role, and broader implications for the Middle East. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us today and sharing your expertise for our viewers. Be sure to check the link in the description for Anna's book. Stay tuned for more insightful discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.